The rancid tang of stale beer and splintered pine clung to Ilara's threadbare shawl like the shroud that had once enveloped her shriveled spirit, a constant, suffocating reminder of her inescapable fate in Redemption Creek, where the omnipresent dust seemed to settle not just on the ramshackle buildings, but deep within the crevices of every soul. Each morning, long before the sun's first anemic rays clawed their way over the jagged, unforgiving horizon, she felt the familiar, unwelcome weight of the galvanized bucket and the rough, abrasive cloth, instruments of her forced penance. Her widowhood, a brand of shame seared onto her very being, condemned her to this endless, thankless pilgrimage through the town's perpetually grimy taverns, scrubbing away the accumulated filth of strangers whose lives, however dissolute, seemed infinitesimally more dignified than her own. Her eyes, once alight with a youthful, defiant spark, now reflected only the resigned silence of the vast, indifferent plains and the persistent, haunting memory of the damp, rich scent of earth that had irrevocably claimed her husband. On a day indistinguishable from countless others, as the persistent ache gnawed at her knees upon the encrusted floorboards of the saloon, a sudden sharp cry tore through the persistent, abrasive song of the wind, silencing the desolate melody and freezing the very air in her lungs. Before the last drop of suds had dripped from her rough cloth onto the scarred floorboards, sudden chilling silence swallowed the saloon's muted morning murmur, a pregnant stillness that prickled the hairs on Ilara's neck with an instinctive dread. Sheriff Thorne, a man whose shadows stretched longer and more ominously than his already formidable reputation, materialized before her, his presence a palpable weight in the suddenly hushed room. His eyes, the cold, unblinking grey of a winter sky, found hers across the dim space, holding her captive in their frigid intensity. Without a single uttered word, with the precise, deliberate motion of a seasoned hunter securing his prey, he reached down and brutally tore the sodden, filthy cleaning cloth from her trembling, numb fingers. That singular, audacious gesture instantly froze the tentative morning-after-the-night-before hum of the entire town, transforming the mournful sigh of the wind outside into an unnerving, palpable presage of something dire. A jolt of pure, unadulterated terror mingled with a strange, forbidden spark of hope, dancing an unsettling jig within Ilara's chest, leaving her breath caught somewhere between a gasp and a prayer. Was this finally the cruel end to her ceaseless, soul-crushing torture, or merely the chilling prelude to a new, perhaps even more profound humiliation? The vivid, unwelcome image of her husband's lifeless body, discovered upon those very same unforgiving, arid lands, bloomed in the dark corners of her mind, a spectral bloom in the dust. A profound, terrible secret lay buried between the pervasive dust and the town's collective silence, a truth she had sworn to inter forever, yet which now seemed to be violently sprouting, tenacious as a desert weed, through the hardened crust of her carefully constructed composure. The sheriff's face, as he finally turned it towards the now completely paralyzed crowd, was etched with an uncommon, almost unnerving severity, yet his eyes, quick as a lizard's tongue, darted furtively to a newly arrived diligence that had just pulled into the main street, its arrival stirring not just more dust but also bringing with it a name, whispered from an unseen mouth that made Ilara's blood run utterly, terrifyingly cold. As Thorne finally began to speak, his gaze briefly, piercingly, found hers again, and within their depths she discerned not merely accusation, but a profound, somber recognition of what the parched earth of Redemption Creek, and only she, had meticulously guarded since that fateful, unforgotten night. Sheriff Thorne's voice, when it finally broke the suffocating quiet, was a gravelly rumble that seemed to cling to the arid air, carrying an unspoken weight that silenced even the persistent creak of the empty saloon doors. He held Ilara's damp cleaning rag, a pathetic, soiled square of fabric, in his large calloused hand, dangling it like an accusation before the assembly of slack-jawed townsfolk who watched from the porch and dusty street, their faces a tableau of morbid curiosity and ingrained fear. His gaze swept over them, a slow, deliberate movement that missed no one before settling with an unnerving precision on the diligence, its wheels still settling into the ruts of the road, and then, inexplicably, back to Elara, whose breath had hitched somewhere in her throat, refusing to descend. A lone figure, cloaked and hat pulled low, began to descend from the coach, their movements hesitant, almost reluctant, and as a new whisper, colder than any desert night, snaked. Through the hushed gathering, the words Deputy Briggs reached Elara's ears, solidifying the name she had dreaded, and twisting a knot of pure terror in her already churning gut, leaving an acrid taste of ash and apprehension on her tongue. The weight of the sheriff's earlier glance now amplified by the chilling arrival of Deputy Briggs, a name that carried the faint metallic scent of justice and the heavy, earthy aroma of freshly turned soil, pressed down upon Elara's shoulders with the crushing force of a boulder, pinning her to the grimy planks of the saloon floor. Her fingers, still remembering the rough texture of the cleaning cloth, now twitched with an involuntary tremor, a primal response to the sudden, stark unraveling of the precarious piece she had so painstakingly woven around her widowhood. The memory of her husband, not as he was in life, but as he appeared on that desolate morning, face upturned to the indifferent sky, the strange wound, and the peculiar silence of the discovery, flashed behind her eyes, quick and brutal as a rattlesnake strike. This was not merely an end to her endless scrubbing, but the sharp, cruel edge of a shovel digging into the very earth where she had buried not only her husband's broken body, but also the bitter truth that Redemption Creek had never truly forgotten, only pretended to. A chilling, almost exhilarating spark of defiance, fleeting yet potent, ignited deep within her hollowed chest, a forbidden fire against the encroaching darkness. The oppressive silence in the saloon only amplified the diligence's creak and the heavy thud of Deputy Briggs's boots on the dusty ground outside, each sound a drumbeat against Elara's taut nerves. His entrance, a broad-shouldered silhouette framed by the midday sun, brought a dread more insidious than Thorne's icy glare, for Briggs was known for methodical persistence, a man chipping away at stone until truth, however ugly, was exposed. A hushed sigh rippled through the onlookers, a testament to the town's unspoken understanding that Briggs's presence was never an accident, never a mere formality, but always the harbinger of unwelcome reckoning. Elara's bare knuckles, stinging from the rough cloth torn from her grasp, felt her breath catch, the metallic taste of fear coating her tongue as the deputy's cool, assessing gaze swept over the frozen tableau, settling with unnerving precision upon Sheriff Thorne. The air thickened with unspoken accusations and the dusty scent of forgotten crimes as Thorne, his stern face betraying nothing, offered a curt nod, a silent acknowledgement of the grim task that had finally arrived at Redemption Creek's doorstep, specifically for her. Her husband's body, stiff and cold where parched earth met thorny scrub, became a suffocating presence, filling the saloon's rancid air, pushing against her ribs until a phantom ache joined the throbbing in her knees. Briggs's arrival wasn't a threat to her precarious freedom. It was an unwelcome resurrection of that harrowing dawn, of the peculiar stillness following the discovery, a quiet, always more conspiratorial than sorrowful. She could taste the coppery tang of that morning's dusty air, see the flies buzzing, oblivious to human tragedy, and feel the gritty soil beneath her fingernails as she instinctively reached out, not to mourn, but to examine. The secret, buried deep beneath layers of grief and forced forgetfulness, now thrummed beneath her skin like a trapped bird, desperate to escape yet terrified of the light. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, fixed on Briggs, not truly seeing the man but the looming shadow he cast, the shadow of inevitable exposure, of a truth that would shatter her fragile peace, and perhaps finally grant her a freedom she both craved and utterly dreaded. Deputy Briggs moved with an almost unnerving economy, his long duster swaying slightly with each measured step as he crossed the threshold of the saloon, the scent of horse, sweat and road dust clinging to him like a second skin, replacing the stale odors of stale beer and desperation that typically permeated the room. His gaze, devoid of the usual curiosity or bluster that marked most new arrivals in Redemption Creek, swept over the frozen patrons, then settled briefly on Thorne before finally, deliberately, finding Elara. A chill, sharper than any winter wind, traced a path up her spine, even as the rough texture of the splintered floorboards dug into her knees. anchoring her in a moment that stretched into an eternity. She felt the phantom brush of her husband's cold skin against her fingertips, the memory of her own desperate search for meaning in the senselessness of his death, resurfacing with a terrifying clarity that made the very air seem thin and hard to draw. The distant chime of the saloon's perpetually unhinged bell, stirred by a breath of the outside world, felt like a funeral toll, sealing her fate even before a single word was spoken. Thorne, his posture still rigid, offered a curt, almost imperceptible nod to Briggs, a silent language passing between the lawmen that spoke volumes to Alara's terrified heart, confirming her deepest fears. The air, thick with unspoken questions and held breaths, seemed to press down on her, an invisible weight threatening to crush the last vestiges of her fragile composure. She could feel the stares of the townspeople, a heavy, tangible presence on her back, their judgment a familiar, stinging lash against her already raw spirit. Yet, amidst the terror that threatened to consume her, a tiny, defiant ember sparked deep within her chest, a stubborn refusal to break, to simply surrender to the grim narrative unfolding around her. Her gaze, though outwardly resigned, held an unyielding flicker of the fight that had kept her alive through her bereavement, a desperate, silent promise to herself that whatever truth was about to be unearthed, she would face it, come what may, even if it meant tearing open wounds that had never truly healed. Briggs, a man whose movements were as precise as a clockwork mechanism, stepped down from the diligence, his polished boots kicking up a small plume of the fine dust that seemed to coat everything in Redemption Creek. He didn't rush, didn't falter, simply surveyed the scene with an impassive gaze that nonetheless held a chilling intensity, a predatory calm that sent a fresh shiver coursing through Alara's already trembling frame. The clink of his spurs, a rhythmic, deliberate sound against the quieted street, resonated in her ears like a death knell, each metallic whisper dredging up fragments of that awful day. The muted thud of earth hitting wood, the distant caw of a scavenger bird, the sickly, sweet aroma of something ending. His eyes, cool and analytical, eventually settled on Sheriff Thorne, but not before sweeping over the tableau, briefly catching Alara's own wide, terrified stare, a silent acknowledgement passing between them that felt less like recognition and more like a pronouncement of doom. Her throat tightened, raw and aching, a desperate plea for breath caught somewhere behind her ribs, as the full, crushing weight of what his arrival signified settled upon her, a certainty as suffocating as the shroud that had once covered her beloved's still form. Thorne offered a terse, almost imperceptible nod, a signal that passed between him and Briggs like an unseen current, while the deputy's expression remained unreadable, a mask of professional detachment that only deepened Alara's gnawing dread. The whispered name, still ringing in her ears, now seemed to solidify into a tangible threat, a shadow stretching from the past to envelop her present. She could feel the spectral touch of her husband's cold hand in hers again, the phantom scent of damp earth and fear rising around her, a vivid hallucination brought forth by Briggs's methodical presence and the unyielding glint in Thorne's eyes. The unspoken secret, a corrosive truth buried deep within the arid soil of Redemption Creek, pulsed behind her temples, an insistent beat against the inside of her skull, threatening to burst forth and shatter the fragile edifice of her carefully constructed silence. Every fiber of her being screamed to flee, to vanish into the shimmering heat haze, but her feet remained rooted to the grimy planks, a prisoner in her own skin, awaiting the inevitable unraveling of her world under the unforgiving gaze of the two lawmen. Alara's breath caught, a thin, reedy sound lost beneath the persistent hum of the saloon, a mixture of stale beer, sawdust, and the nervous murmurings of the stunned patrons who had momentarily forgotten their own miserable existences to gawk at the unfolding drama. The rough texture of the floorboards beneath her calloused knees suddenly felt sharper, pressing into her flesh like an accusation, each splinter a tiny, insistent prod against the fragile veneer of her composure. Briggs, with a deliberate slowness that spoke of unyielding purpose, moved from the diligence, his boots crunching on the gravel, a sound that seemed amplified in the sudden, eerie quiet, heading straight for the saloon doors without a glance at the gawking crowd, his gaze fixed, unwavering, upon Thorn and by extension upon her. The very air around her thrummed with an unspoken command, a silent current of authority that seemed to pin her to the spot, making her feel as exposed and vulnerable as a rabbit, caught in a trap under the merciless glare of a midday sun. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird, each beat echoing the name that had been whispered, a name now inextricably linked to the scent of cold earth and the chilling memory of what she had seen that night. Briggs entered the saloon, his silhouette briefly eclipsing the harsh afternoon light, a silent, imposing figure whose presence seemed to draw all the latent shadows from the corners of the room, making the already dim interior feel even more oppressive. The clink of a dropped glass somewhere in the back shattered the hushed tension, only to be swallowed instantly by the palpable fear that now thickened the air, a rancid, metallic taste on Ilara's tongue. She watched, mesmerized by a terror that rooted her to the spot, as Briggs moved with an almost preternatural calm, his eyes sweeping over the frozen faces of the patrons before settling, with an unsettling finality, upon her and Thorn. There was no aggression in his posture, only an unyielding resolve that resonated with a deeper, more chilling threat than any overt display of anger could ever convey. A quiet certainty that whispered of irrefutable evidence and the cold, unfeeling machinery of justice, now grinding inexorably towards her. The floorboards beneath her suddenly felt less like solid ground and more like a flimsy raft on a tumultuous, unseen current, pulling her closer to the edge of an abyss she had long fought to keep, hidden beneath layers of dust and forced amnesia. The unblinking intensity of Deputy Briggs's stare, a gaze that seemed to peel away layers of dust and time, pierced Ilara's very core, a searing brand on her spirit as the fragile scaffolding of her forced composure began to buckle and splinter. A tremor, barely perceptible, coursed through her limbs, the rough fibers of the cleaning rag still clutched in Thorn's hand, now a stark white flag against the dark fabric of his trousers, a silent, to the abrupt halt of her daily torment. The oppressive stillness in the saloon hung heavy, a shroud woven from anticipation and dread, so profound that the rhythmic thump of Ilara's own frantic heartbeat seemed to reverberate off the grimy walls, a drumbeat of impending doom echoing in the cavernous silence. She could taste the dry, metallic tang of fear on her tongue, mingling with the persistent smell of stale beer and unwashed bodies, a sickening combination that threatened to overwhelm her senses and drag her back to that cold, damp earth where her husband's secret lay buried. The weight of countless eyes, unseen yet acutely felt, pressed down upon her, each glance a tiny pinprick of judgment, as if the entire town had suddenly become complicit in Briggs's unspoken accusations. Deputy Briggs, a man whose presence was as solid and unyielding as the granite of distant peaks, finally moved, his stride deliberate, each heavy bootfall on the worn floorboards a pronouncement of immutable fact, closing the distance between them with unnerving calm. His hand, unhurried yet purposeful, reached inside his coat, not for a weapon, but to retrieve a leather-bound ledger, its aged cover scuffed and faded, yet exuding an aura of undeniable authority that made Ilara's breath catch in her throat. He didn't speak, not yet, but the way his fingers gently traced the spine of the book, then paused, his thumb resting on a particular page, spoke volumes, confirming her deepest, most chilling suspicions without a single uttered word. The world around her, previously dimmed and indistinct, now sharpened into terrifying clarity, the dust motes dancing in the meager sunlight, slicing through the saloon's grimy window, the faint scent of wood smoke from a distant chimney, the almost imperceptible creak of the building settling, all conspired to etch this moment into her memory with agonizing precision. A prelude to the inevitable storm that was about to break over, Redemption Creek, threatening to unearth more than just the secrets of the parched land. The leather-bound ledger, a silent, damning testament, became the absolute center of Ilara's universe, every faded line on its cover a precursor to the unraveling she knew awaited her, a truth far more terrifying than the physical pain of her daily toil. Deputy Briggs, his presence as solid and unyielding as the ironwood trees that dotted the distant mesas, kept his gaze locked on the book, a deliberate, agonizing delay that only amplified the thrumming fear in her chest, each beat echoing the finality of a death knell. She could feel Sheriff Thorne's own tension radiating beside her, a subtle stiffening of his frame, a barely perceptible clenching of his jaw that suggested a shared, terrible understanding of the ledger's weight, a burden that seemed to press down on the entire room. The saloon, once filled with the cacophony of life, now held its breath, suspended in a moment of communal dread. The only sound the soft, insistent whine of the wind through a broken pane, a mournful dirge for secrets about to be dragged into the harsh Redemption Creek light, a clarity Elara desperately wished to avoid. The smell of stale whiskey and fear, thick and cloying, clung to the air, making it heavy, difficult to breathe, as if the very atmosphere itself conspired to suffocate the truth before it could break free. Then, with the slow, methodical pace of a man who understood the crushing power of expectation, Briggs finally lifted his eyes from the ledger's worn pages, their cold, unwavering blue piercing the suffocating silence, settling first on Sheriff Thorne, then moving with deliberate, almost cruel slowness to meet Elara's own desperate gaze. In that endless moment, as their eyes locked, she saw not just accusation, but a profound, sorrowful recognition of the intricate web of deceit that had bound her to this parched land, a silent acknowledgement that the whispers of the wind had finally found a voice that could not be denied. His fingers, still resting on the ledger, shifted almost imperceptibly, a minute gesture that nonetheless sent a fresh wave of icy terror through her veins, a stark, visceral reminder that the brittle shield of her silence was about to shatter, revealing the raw, ugly truth beneath, a truth she had buried with her husband. The collective gasp of the townsfolk, barely audible, was like the sound of dry leaves skittering across barren earth, a prelude to the storm that was gathering, not in the sky but in the depths of human memory and judgment, ready to break over Redemption Creek with an unforgiving force. With a soft, almost reverent sigh that seemed to carry the weight of forgotten truths, Deputy Briggs finally lowered his gaze from Elara's trembling face, allowing his thumb to brush almost imperceptibly across the rough, aged leather of the ledger he clutched in his hand. The silence stretched, thin and brittle, magnifying the creak of the saloon floorboards beneath the weight of restless feet and the distant mournful cry of a coyote carried on a capricious breeze. His voice, when it finally came, was a low, resonant rumble, stripped of any hurried inflection, yet it pierced the suffocating air with the force of a sudden, unexpected gunshot, addressing Sheriff Thorne directly, but with an undercurrent of sorrowful accusation that swept over Elara like a chilling wave. "Sheriff," he began, the single word hanging in, the air like a pronouncement. "This ledger, found tucked away in the dusty confines of the old assay office, speaks volumes about the dealings of a certain miner named Silas Vance, a man whose untimely demise, as we all recall, cast a long, unsettling shadow across this very town." Elara felt a cold dread constricting her chest, her breath catching in her throat, the very mention of Vance's name a physical blow, a confirmation that the earth itself was now conspiring to betray the secret she had guarded so fiercely. Elara's world, already a landscape of perpetual grief, now fractured further, the image of her late husband's stark, lifeless face resurfacing with brutal clarity against the backdrop of the dusty saloon, his familiar scent of earth and stale sweat mingling with the bitter tang of imminent exposure. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through Sheriff Thorne's broad shoulders at the mention of Silas Vance, a fleeting tightening of the muscles in his jaw that only Elara, acutely attuned to the subtle shifts in the air, would have noticed amidst the frozen tableau of the onlookers. His cold eyes, however, remained fixed on Briggs, betraying nothing but a steely, unyielding resolve, a mask perfected through years of frontier law. Yet Elara sensed a desperate undercurrent, a man bracing himself against an inevitable tide. The townsfolk, a collective breath held captive, stirred restlessly, their murmurs growing louder, a dry rustle of speculation that was now laced with an undeniable thread of suspicion, each face a canvas of dawning comprehension, as the implications of Briggs's words began to unfurl like a dark banner against the stark, merciless light streaming through the saloon's grimy windows. Briggs, his voice cutting through the thickening silence like a rusty blade, now opened the ledger with a deliberate, almost ritualistic solemnity, the brittle pages rustling faintly in the stale saloon air, each sound amplified by the sudden, suffocating quiet that had seized Redemption Creek. He didn't speak immediately, but his gaze, sharp and unwavering, shifted from the ledger's cryptic entries to Sheriff Thorne's unyielding face, then, for a fleeting, condemning instant, met Ilara's wide, terror-stricken eyes, a silent accusation passing between them that tightened the knot of dread in her gut until she felt she might vomit. The townsfolk collectively leaned forward, their suspicion now morphing into a hungry anticipation, their breath held in, ragged gasps, the creak of floorboards, and the distant jingle of harness bells on the freshly arrived diligence, now serving as an ominous soundtrack to the impending revelation. Ilara could feel the cold sweat trickling down her spine, the weight of the collective stare pressing upon her, a palpable force that threatened to crush the last vestiges of her composure as the truth, like a coiled viper, prepared to strike from the dust-laden pages. Then, with the quiet force of a man delivering a long-awaited verdict, Briggs pointed a finger at a specific entry in the ledger, its faded ink tracing a transaction that spoke not merely of debt, but of a desperate, ill-conceived land deal involving Silas Vance, a deal that, by its very nature, guaranteed his brutal end and implicated the very men who had benefited most, men whose names now stood out starkly on the page, including a prominent figure among the town elders, and, to Ilara's horror, an indirect link that twisted back to Thorne himself, not as a direct perpetrator, but as one who had been privy to the grim truth, choosing silence over justice, a complicity that weighed heavier than any direct blow. A collective gasp rippled through the saloon, and Ilara, her legs finally giving way, crumpled to the floor, the dust gritty against her cheek. Her secret now laid bare not by her own confession, but by the cold, irrefutable evidence of numbers and names, a betrayal that echoed the metallic tang of blood in her mouth. Sheriff Thorne's face, a mask no longer contorted with a silent, profound grief, a realization that the arid lands of Redemption Creek had indeed kept their secrets, but that the truth, like the most tenacious weed, would always find a way to break through the parched earth, bringing with it not salvation, but an even deeper despair for all involved. The story of Silas Vance and the grim dance of silence and complicity finally found its brutal, public conclusion, shattering the fragile peace of Redemption Creek.